The streetlights cast a warm glow over the palm-lined streets of Palm Beach as Officer James Mitchell settled into his usual patrol route. The clock on his dashboard showed 9:45 p.m., and the night had been surprisingly quiet for a Thursday. He'd spent most of his shift helping an elderly couple change their flat tire and redirecting tourists who'd gotten lost looking for their beachfront hotel. Taking a sip from his now lukewarm coffee, Officer Mitchell couldn't help but smile thinking about how different his life was from his childhood dreams of high-speed chases and dramatic arrests. Reality was mostly about helping people with small problems, and he'd grown to love that part of his job more than he ever expected. The radio crackled with routine updates from dispatch, mostly about minor incidents around town. He'd just passed the fancy shopping district when his radar gun picked up a black SUV going 48 in a 35 zone. Nothing crazy, but enough to warrant a warning at least. Without giving it much thought, he flipped on his lights and radioed in the stop. The SUV pulled over smoothly into a well-lit area near a closed boutique shop. Officer Mitchell noticed the vehicle was a high-end model, probably worth more than he'd make in 3 years. That wasn't unusual in Palm Beach, where luxury cars were as common as seagulls. He followed standard procedure, positioning his patrol car slightly offset for safety, just like he'd done hundreds of times before. As he stepped out of his cruiser, the warm Florida breeze carried the salt smell from the nearby ocean. His polished shoes crunched against the small bits of shells scattered on the pavement, a constant reminder of how close they were to the beach. He adjusted his body camera and straightened his badge. Habits drilled into him since his academy days. Something felt different about this stop, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Maybe it was how perfectly the SUV had pulled over, or how the engine shut off immediately without him having to ask. Through the tinted windows, he could make out movement in the back seat, but nothing clear enough to identify. Walking up to the vehicle, Officer Mitchell noticed small details that started setting off quiet alarms in his mind. The license plate wasn't standard issue. The tires had special markings he'd never seen before, and was that a tiny antenna on the roof. Before he could process these observations, he spotted something else, a small flag detail on the rear window that made his heart skip a beat. Approaching the driver's side, he noticed how the other cars on the street seemed to have disappeared, leaving an unusual quietness broken only by the soft hum of his body camera and the distant sound of waves. The window began to roll down with a smooth, expensive-sounding whir, and Officer Mitchell's routine traffic stop was about to become anything but routine. He had no way of knowing that in the next few minutes, his entire life would take an unexpected turn. All because he decided to pull over a black SUV on what he thought would be just another quiet night in Palm Beach. Sometimes the biggest moments in life come disguised as ordinary ones, and Officer Mitchell was about to learn that lesson firsthand. As the window rolled down with that quiet, expensive hum, Officer Mitchell's flashlight beam caught something that made him freeze mid-step. The interior wasn't just luxurious. It was practically a mobile office. But that wasn't what made his throat go dry. There in the back seat was one of the most recognizable faces in the world, looking back at him with that famous expression he'd seen countless times on TV. His training kicked in automatically, even as his mind raced to process what he was seeing. The distinctive swept-back hair, the familiar face that had graced everything from magazine covers to presidential debates. Former President Donald Trump was sitting right there, watching him with what looked like mild curiosity. Officer Mitchell's hand instinctively went to straighten his uniform, suddenly very aware that his coffee-stained notepad was probably not the most professional accessory for this particular traffic stop. The young officer's mind flashed back to his mom's living room, where she still kept a campaign poster from years ago. She'd never believe this, if he was even allowed to tell her about it. The Secret Service agent in the front seat had already rolled down his window too, holding out credentials that looked far more official than anything Officer Mitchell usually saw. "Evening, officer," the agent said in a tone that was professional but carried an unmistakable weight of authority. "I understand we might have been going a bit fast there." Before Officer Mitchell could respond, He heard Trump's distinctive voice from the back seat. "You know, I always tell them to follow the speed limit, but sometimes these guys get a little too protective." There was a hint of amusement in his voice that made the situation feel surprisingly less tense. The young officer's police academy training hadn't exactly covered how to handle pulling over a former president. His palms were sweating, and he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. 3 years on the force had prepared him for drunk drivers, domestic disputes, and even a few high-stress chases, but this was definitely not in the manual. What happened next would have made headlines if anyone had been around to see it. Trump, instead of staying in the car as most VIPs would, reached for the door handle. The Secret Service agent turned around sharply, but Trump waved him off with a gesture that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd gone off script. "Mind if I step out for a minute, officer?" Trump asked, though he was already moving. "You know, I have tremendous respect for law enforcement." "Tremendous. And I'd love to hear how things are going here in Palm Beach." The way he said it made it sound less like a political statement and more like genuine curiosity. Officer Mitchell found himself nodding, his training wrestling with his surprise. As Trump stepped out into the warm Florida night, the young officer noticed something that the TV cameras never quite captured: how the former president had a way of making every situation feel like a casual conversation between neighbors, even when one of those neighbors had just pulled him over for speeding. The streetlights cast long shadows on the Palm Line Street as both men stepped away from the vehicle. The Secret Service agent exited too, maintaining a respectful distance while keeping a watchful eye on their surroundings. In that moment, standing on a quiet Palm Beach street with one of the most famous people in the world, Officer Mitchell had no idea that this routine traffic stop was about to turn into something that would change not just his life, but his entire perspective on what it means to serve the public. The warm Florida breeze rustled through the palm trees as Officer Mitchell cleared his throat, trying to find the right words. It's one thing to explain a traffic violation to an ordinary citizen, but explaining it to a former president, that wasn't covered in any training manual he'd ever seen. "Mr. President," he started, then caught himself. "I mean, former president, sir. I clocked your vehicle at 48 in a 35 zone." His voice came out steadier than he expected, considering how fast his heart was racing. The body camera on his chest felt suddenly very heavy, and he wondered if this would end up being one of those viral moments he'd never live down. Trump's response caught him completely off guard. Instead of showing any annoyance or pulling rank, the former president actually chuckled. "You know what? You're absolutely right," he said, gesturing at the speed limit sign nearby. "These guys," he nodded toward his Secret Service detail, "sometimes they get a little too careful about my schedule. But the law is the law, isn't it?" The Secret Service agent standing nearby maintained his professional stance, but Officer Mitchell could have sworn he saw a slight smile crack through that stern expression. The agent's earpiece crackled quietly in the night air, a reminder that this wasn't just any traffic stop. There were probably a dozen other agents in the vicinity, hidden from view. "I have to say," Trump continued, looking genuinely interested, "it's refreshing to meet an officer who just does his job, no matter who's in the car. That's what makes America work, right? Good people doing their jobs the right way." He wasn't speaking in his rally voice. This was quieter, more conversational, like two people chatting over a fence between their yards. Officer Mitchell felt some of his nervousness melting away. He pulled out his notepad, then realized he wasn't quite sure what to do next. Should he write a warning? A ticket? Was there even a protocol for this situation? The notepad suddenly felt very small and inadequate in his hands. "I was actually heading to a late dinner meeting," Trump said, gesturing down the road. "But you know what? This is more interesting. Tell me, how long have you been on the force?" His question seemed genuine, not like the usual small talk people make when they're trying to get out of a ticket. The young officer found himself answering honestly, 3 years, sir. started right after everything with COVID settled down. He was surprised by how natural the conversation felt, despite the surreal circumstances. Trump nodded thoughtfully, then looked around at the quiet street. The lights from nearby shops created a soft glow, and somewhere in the distance, they could hear the gentle sound of waves hitting the beach. "You picked a tough time to become a police officer," he said. "Lot of challenges these days, but we need good people like you out there." Just then, the Secret Service agent stepped slightly closer, probably about to remind his charge about that dinner meeting. But Trump held up his hand in a way that suggested he wasn't quite ready to end this conversation. There was something on his mind, and Officer Mitchell could see him considering his next words carefully. What happened next would turn this routine traffic stop into something neither man would ever forget. As Trump reached into his jacket pocket, the Secret Service agent tensed slightly, a reflex born from years of protection duty. But the former president wasn't reaching for anything official or important. Instead, he pulled out something that would lead to a conversation neither of them expected to have on this quiet Palm Beach evening. From his jacket pocket, Trump pulled out what looked like an old, worn photograph. The edges were slightly frayed, suggesting it was something he carried often. "You remind me of someone," he said, looking at the photo briefly before turning his attention back to Officer Mitchell. "Someone who taught me a lot about respect and doing the right thing." The young officer stood there, aware that this routine traffic stop had somehow transformed into something entirely different. The nearby palm trees swayed gently in the evening breeze, and a few late-night joggers passed by, doing double takes at the scene unfolding on their usual running route. "Would you mind taking a short walk with me?" Trump asked, gesturing toward a well-lit walkway near the closed boutiques. The Secret Service agent stepped forward, about to protest, but Trump waved him off with the familiarity of someone used to pushing the boundaries of protocol. "Just a few steps. Sometimes the best conversations happen when you're moving." Officer Mitchell glanced at his patrol car, then back at the former president. His training told him to keep things professional and brief, but something in Trump's manner suggested this wasn't about politics or publicity. This felt genuine, almost personal. "Of course, sir," he found himself saying, falling into step beside the former president. The Secret Service agent followed at a respectful distance, speaking quietly into his wrist microphone to coordinate with other agents in the area. The sound of their footsteps echoed softly off the storefronts, mixing with the distant sound of waves. "You know," Trump began as they walked, "most people think being president is all about big decisions and fancy meetings. But the most important lessons I learned came from everyday people doing their jobs with pride." He paused near a bench, though neither man sat down. The streetlight above cast a warm glow that made the moment feel almost theatrical. The photograph in Trump's hand caught the light, and Officer Mitchell could now see it was a picture of what looked like a much younger Trump standing with a police officer from decades ago. The officer in the photo wore an old-style uniform, and both men in the picture were smiling like old friends. "Back in the 80s, Trump continued, his voice taking on a softer tone that rarely made it to television, "I got pulled over just like tonight. Different city, different time, but the officer showed me something I never forgot." He looked at the photo one more time before carefully tucking it back into his jacket. Officer Mitchell waited, sensing there was more to the story. A gentle breeze carried the smell of nearby jasmine flowers, and somewhere in the distance, a car horn honked, reminding them they weren't alone in the world, though it felt like it in that moment. "That officer could have treated me differently because of who I was," Trump said, turning to face the young policeman directly. "Instead, he treated me exactly the same as he would have treated anyone else. And you know what? That taught me more about real leadership than any business school ever could." The weight of the moment wasn't lost on Officer Mitchell. Here he was, standing on a quiet Palm Beach street, having a conversation about integrity and duty with one of the most famous people in the world. And somehow, it felt completely natural, like two people sharing truths they both understood. What happened next would take this unexpected encounter in an even more surprising direction, as Trump was about to share something that would change not just Officer Mitchell's night, but potentially his entire life. The former president's expression shifted, suggesting he was about to move from reminiscing to something more immediate and personal. Trump leaned against the decorative stone wall of a nearby boutique, his usual formal posture relaxing slightly. The Secret Service agent had taken up position near a palm tree, giving them space while staying vigilant. The quiet evening air made their conversation feel more intimate, like two people sharing stories on a front porch rather than a former president and a police officer who just met. "You know what the hardest part about being president was?" Trump asked, though it seemed more like he was thinking out loud. It wasn't the big decisions or the late-night crisis calls. It was staying connected to regular people, understanding what their daily lives were really like. Officer Mitchell listened, noticing how different Trump's voice sounded from his TV appearances, softer, more reflective. A couple walking their dog passed by, doing a double take at the scene, but kept moving when the Secret Service agent gave them a subtle nod. "I've dealt with law enforcement my whole life," Trump continued, gesturing with his hands in his characteristic way, but more subdued. "But it's different now, isn't it? Your job's gotten harder. More cameras, more pressure, more people ready to judge every little decision you make." The young officer found himself nodding. "Yes, sir, that's true. Sometimes we have to make split-second choices that people will spend months analyzing." He surprised himself with his candor, but something about this moment felt safe for honest conversation. Trump's eyes lit up with recognition. "Exactly. You know, I had to make this decision once." He launched into a story about a critical moment during his presidency, but he told it differently than his usual rally style. This was personal, like sharing a lesson learned the hard way. As they talked, Officer Mitchell shared some of his own experiences: the elderly man he'd helped during a heart attack last month, the lost child he'd reunited with her parents at the beach, the countless small moments that made up a police officer's real life. Trump listened intently, occasionally nodding or asking questions that showed he was genuinely engaged. "The media, they love to show the dramatic stuff," Trump said, shaking his head. "The chases, the confrontations, but they miss all this, the real work, the human part." He gestured toward Officer Mitchell's badge. "That shield means something different when you're actually wearing it, doesn't it?" A gentle breeze rustled through the palm trees, carrying the salt air from the nearby ocean. The street remained quiet, creating an almost surreal bubble around their conversation. The Secret Service agent checked his watch but didn't interrupt. "You know what I learned in business, and later in politics," Trump continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "It's not the big moments that define us. It's how we handle the small ones, when we think nobody important is watching." He paused, looking directly at the young officer. "But tonight, I'm watching, and I'm impressed." Officer Mitchell felt the weight of those words. Here was one of the most powerful men in the world, taking time to understand the daily life of a regular police officer. It wasn't about politics anymore. This was about two people sharing their perspectives on service, duty, and the importance of doing the right thing. The conversation was about to take another unexpected turn, as Trump seemed to be building up to something more personal. His expression changed slightly, suggesting he was about to move from these general observations to something more specific, something that would make this chance encounter truly unforgettable. The night had grown quieter, with only the distant sound of waves and occasional palm fronds rustling in the breeze. Officer Mitchell shifted his weight slightly, aware that his radio had been silent for a while. Dispatch giving him space for what had clearly become more than a routine traffic stop. "You know," Officer Mitchell began, surprising himself with his willingness to share, "my mom always taught me to treat everyone the same, no matter who they are." He paused, remembering her words. "She'd be amazed I'm standing here talking to you right now." Trump's expression changed subtly at the mention of the officer's mother. "Tell me about her," he said, his tone encouraging rather than demanding. The parking lot lights cast long shadows around them, creating an oddly intimate space for such a personal conversation. Officer Mitchell felt a lump form in his throat, but something about the moment made it feel right to share. "She's actually in Palm Beach Memorial right now," he said quietly. "Been there for 3 weeks. Cancer." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with all its implications. The former president's reaction wasn't what Officer Mitchell expected. Instead of offering the usual polite sympathies, Trump's face showed genuine concern. "Cancer," he repeated softly, looking down at the ground for a moment. "I've lost good friends to that. Too many good friends." The Secret Service agent nearby shifted position slightly, perhaps sensing the change in the conversation's tone. A car passed slowly on the street, its headlights briefly illuminating their small group before moving on, leaving them in their private bubble of streetlight again. "She still has your picture on her wall, you know," Officer Mitchell continued, managing a small smile. "Right next to mine from Police Academy graduation. She says they're both pictures of people who served the country, just in different ways." Trump listened intently, his usual bigger-than-life presence softening into something more human, more accessible. "What kind of cancer?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood more about the subject than most people might expect. "Pancreatic," Officer Mitchell replied, the medical term feeling strange in his mouth. "They caught it late, but she's fighting. She's always been a fighter." He hadn't planned to share this with anyone tonight, least of all during a traffic stop with a former president. Trump nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. He seemed to be making some kind of decision, his eyes focused on something distant. The warm Florida night wrapped around them like a blanket, making this surprising conversation feel almost dreamlike. "You know," Trump said finally, reaching into his jacket again, "I have some friends at Mayo Clinic. Good friends, the best doctors you'll ever meet." He pulled out his phone, its screen glowing in the darkness. "What's your mother's name?" Officer Mitchell felt his heart skip a beat, realizing this conversation had just taken another unexpected turn. The former president wasn't just making polite conversation. He was about to do something that would change everything. As he watched Trump begin to dial a number, he understood that this night was about to become much more than just an unusual traffic stop story to tell at family dinners. The soft glow from Trump's phone illuminated his face as he dialed. "Hold on just a minute," he said to Officer Mitchell, raising one finger. The young officer watched in amazement as the former president stepped a few paces away, speaking in low tones into his phone. The Secret Service agent maintained his position, but his expression had softened slightly, as if he'd seen his charge do this kind of thing before. "Dr. Thompson." "Yes, I know it's late." Trump's voice carried just enough for Officer Mitchell to hear. "Listen, I've got something important here in Palm Beach. Remember that favor you owe me?" He turned slightly, glancing back at the officer with what looked like a hint of a smile. Officer Mitchell stood there, his ticket book forgotten in his hand, as the former president of the United States made a second call, then a third. Each conversation was brief but purposeful. The palm trees swayed gently overhead, their leaves creating shifting shadows on the pavement, while the officer tried to process what was happening. "Your mother," Trump said, walking back to him. "What's her room number at Palm Beach Memorial?" His phone was still in his hand, the screen's glow reflecting off his face. When Officer Mitchell hesitated, Trump added, "Trust me on this one." With slightly shaking hands, the young officer pulled out his own phone, finding the text from his sister with their mom's room information. As he read it out, Trump typed it into his phone, checking each number carefully. "Room 315, he repeated, making sure he had it right. "I just spoke with 3 of the best doctors I know," Trump explained, putting his phone away. "They're going to review your mother's case first thing in the morning. No charge." He held up his hand when Officer Mitchell started to protest. "And don't worry about insurance or paperwork. I made some calls about that too." The young officer felt his eyes getting wet. He blinked hard, trying to maintain his professional composure. The night air suddenly felt thicker, heavier with the weight of what was happening. A passing car's headlights swept across them, briefly illuminating the scene like a spotlight on a stage. "Mr. President, I don't know what to say." Officer Mitchell managed to get out, his voice barely steady. Trump just smiled, that same smile he'd seen countless times on TV, but somehow different, more genuine, more personal. "Don't say anything," Trump replied, reaching into his jacket once more. This time he pulled out a business card. "This has my private office number. Have your mother's doctor call this tomorrow morning. They'll be expecting it." He handed the card to Officer Mitchell, who took it carefully, as if it might disappear. The Secret Service agent stepped closer, probably ready to remind his charge about that dinner meeting they were now very late for. But Trump wasn't quite finished. He looked at the traffic ticket books, still in Officer Mitchell's hand, and chuckled. "You know what?" Trump said, his voice carrying that familiar mix of authority and amusement. "I think we can forget about that speeding warning. Consider it exchanged for something more important. A reminder that sometimes the best moments in life come from unexpected places." As they walked back toward their vehicles, the night somehow felt different. The same palm trees, the same quiet street, the same warm Florida breeze, but everything had changed. Officer Mitchell clutched the business card in his hand, knowing that this traffic stop had just become a turning point in his life, and more importantly, in his mother's life. The morning sun streamed through the windows of room 315 at Palm Beach Memorial Hospital. Officer Mitchell's mother was sitting up in bed, already looking better than she had in days, perhaps boosted by the excitement in her son's voice when he'd called her early that morning to say someone special was coming to visit. "Mom, you're not going to believe what happened last night," he told her, his voice still carrying the amazement of the previous evening's events. She'd listened, half convinced her son was pulling her leg, as he recounted the unexpected traffic stop and what followed. Now, at precisely 9:30 a.m., there was a gentle knock on the door. The nurse who poked her head in wasn't the usual morning shift nurse. This one wore a slightly nervous expression, like she knew something big was about to happen. "Mrs. Mitchell, you have some visitors." The door opened wider, and in walked not just one doctor, but three. Their white coats were crisp, their manner professional but warm. And behind them, causing the nurse to nearly drop her clipboard, was former President Trump himself, carrying a bouquet of bright yellow flowers. "Good morning." Trump's voice filled the room with its familiar energy, but softer than his public speaking voice. "I heard this is where I could find Officer Mitchell's mother, one of our country's biggest supporters." He smiled, placing the flowers on the bedside table. Officer Mitchell's mother's hands flew to her face, tears welling up in her eyes. The small hospital room suddenly felt very crowded, yet somehow intimate. The sunlight catching the yellow flowers created a warm glow that seemed to match the moment perfectly. The doctors introduced themselves, one from Mayo Clinic, one from Johns Hopkins, and one who'd flown in from MD Anderson Cancer Center. They spoke in clear, simple terms about new treatment options they'd discussed that morning. Words like promising and optimistic filled the air, replacing the heavy silence that had dominated recent hospital visits. Trump stood back, letting the medical professionals do their work, but his presence filled the room with an undeniable energy. He watched the scene unfold with what looked like genuine satisfaction, occasionally nodding as the doctors explained their plans. "You've raised a good son," Trump said quietly to Mrs. Mitchell, while the doctors consulted their notes. "The kind of police officer we need more of in this country, someone who does the right thing, no matter who's in the car he's pulling over." His words made her smile through her tears. The morning passed in a blur of medical discussions, hope-filled plans, and moments that felt almost dreamlike. The hospital staff tried to maintain their professional composure, but word had spread throughout the building. Every now and then, someone would find an excuse to walk past the open door, stealing glances at the unusual gathering inside room 315. As the doctors wrapped up their initial consultation, Trump reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out another business card. "This one's for you," he said, handing it to Mrs. Mitchell. My team will help coordinate everything with the insurance company. You just focus on getting better." The whole scene was surreal. A former president standing in a regular hospital room, the country's top doctors gathered around a police officer's mother, all because of a chance encounter during a routine traffic stop the night before. It was the kind of moment that reminded everyone present that sometimes the most extraordinary things happen in the most ordinary places. 6 months later, Officer Mitchell stood in his usual spot along Palm Beach's coastal road, his radar gun steady in his hands. The morning sun sparkled off the ocean, and the palm trees swayed gently in the breeze. Everything looked the same as that fateful night, but so much had changed. His mother was home now, her treatment having been more successful than anyone had initially hoped. The team of specialists that Trump had brought together had found a new approach that worked remarkably well. She was back to tending her small garden and making her famous key lime pie that the whole police department had come to love. The story had eventually leaked to the local press, though both Officer Mitchell and Trump had tried to keep it quiet. A junior reporter had noticed the unusual gathering of top doctors at Palm Beach Memorial that morning and started asking questions. But when the story broke, it wasn't the sensational headline everyone expected. Instead, it became a quiet tale of human connection. How a routine traffic stop had turned into something that reminded everyone about the power of simple kindness. The article didn't focus on politics or controversy, but on how two people from very different worlds had found common ground on a quiet Florida night. Officer Mitchell's fellow officers occasionally teased him about his celebrity traffic stop, but there was respect behind their playful words. The story had changed something in the department too. Officers started sharing more of their own stories about unexpected moments of connection during routine calls. The break room became a place where they talked about the human side of their work, not just the procedural parts. Trump had kept his word about staying in touch. Every few weeks, his office would call to check on Mrs. Mitchell's progress. The calls were brief but genuine, often just a few minutes to make sure everything was going smoothly with the medical care and insurance coverage. He never publicized these calls or used them for publicity. They remained private, just like that first conversation by the roadside. One morning, as Officer Mitchell was getting ready for his shift, he found a letter in his mailbox. Inside was a photograph, not the old one Trump had shown him that night, but a new one. It showed Trump standing with Officer Mitchell's mother in her hospital room, both of them smiling. On the back was a simple message: "Sometimes the best moments in life come from doing the right thing, even when no one's watching. Keep up the great work." The photograph found its place on Mrs. Mitchell's wall, right next to her son's police academy graduation picture, just as she'd always arranged her precious memories. But now it represented something more. A reminder that beneath all the titles and uniforms, badges and positions, we're all just people capable of touching each other's lives in unexpected ways. As Officer Mitchell stood by his patrol car that morning, watching the sunrise over Palm Beach, he thought about how one traffic stop had changed not just his life, but had created ripples that continued to spread. His fellow officers approached their work with a renewed sense of possibility, never knowing when a routine call might turn into a moment of real human connection. The story had taught him something profound about service, about duty, and about the unexpected ways lives can intersect. Every traffic stop, every routine call, every ordinary moment carried the potential for something extraordinary. All it took was the willingness to see the person behind the situation, to listen, and to remember that sometimes the biggest impacts come from the smallest moments.